Some of the ANC's tripartite alliance partners are calling on the U.S. to lift sanctions against Cuba. It comes as the 7th Africa-Cuba Solidarity Conference takes place in Mpumalanga, where the Caribbean nation has been described as a reliable ally of states facing oppression. For more on this conversation, we're now joined by ANC First Deputy Secretary General Nomvula Mokonyane. Mokonyane, a pleasure to have you on the program this evening. Now, the relationship between Cuba and African states has been well documented over the years. How would you say Cuba has shown its solidarity, especially with oppressed nations?
Thank you very much for inviting us, Ntlanhla. We here hosting on behalf of Africa, the Africa-Cuba Solidarity Conference. It's the 7th conference. The first inaugural conference was held here in South Africa in the Western Cape. Cuba is one of those dependable allies for those who are going through any form of injustice, of colonization, of suppression, and they have always stood on the side of the oppressed and exploited without them demanding anything in return. This is the nation of true internationalists, predating even our dawn of democracy. And us being here 30 years post our democratic dispensation, it is all because of the peace-loving people of Cuba who did not only support us in terms of humanitarian aid, they were also involved in the armed struggle in defense of our own revolution, not only in South Africa, but with all other liberation movements. Cuba is also known as a nation that has got the capacity to deal with diseases and various viruses as they affect human lives. We know that as South Africa, we have also benefited through our relationship between Comrade Fidel Castro and Nelson Mandela, that we have a number of medical doctors who have studied in Cuba. We've also enjoyed the support of the Cuban people in terms of development of young people prior to 1994 in the island of youth, where they had camps training young people from Namibia, from Zimbabwe, from South Africa, from Angola, and so forth. And the other important thing is that with all their challenges of the embargo, Cuba has never actually given up in international solidarity with everybody, those that they identify with their just cause for self-determination, as well as a call for democracy and of importance promotion of humanity. It's men and women of courage, it's men and women of honor, and will forever be indebted to them, many of us. And hence here today you've got over 112 parties that are participating here, as well as representatives of ruling parties that may not necessarily be historical allies, but because of the work that Cuba has played in terms of international solidarity and promotion of social justice, they have come out to pledge the unconditional support for Cuba. We've reached a point where we must now deal with the issue of the blockade beyond just sloganeering and declarations that do not take us to an action where we deal with the economic suffering of the people of Cuba. They were suffering when we were suffering. They liberated us, and today it is our turn, all of us in Africa, to play that very significant role in Cuba that Cuba has played. They've been to Africa. They never left with our resources. They never left with our mineral resources. They carried their dead bodies back to Cuba. And today we can't again have the world keeping quiet on a unilateral illegal blockade that is now affecting Cuba not only politically but also economically. But what inspires us, Ntlanhla, is the determination. The determination of Cuba. Here we've got Comrade Fernando, one of the Cuban five, revolutionary comrades from Cuba, who's now the chair of ICAP, who has also conveyed a message in his own remarks, the first thing he did was to say we owe it to Western Sahara as Africa to ensure that Western Sahara is liberated against the tyranny of Morocco. He raised the issue of Palestine, and yet they themselves are going through the atrocities meted by the United States of America.
It's quite interesting that you've mentioned quite a number of key areas that this meeting will be focusing on. But for the benefit of our viewers, give us a sense of what this conference really is about. As the name suggests, it is a solidarity meeting between Cuba and nations on the African continent. But what would you say are some of the key objectives of this meeting?
It is about putting together programs, interventions from the African participants and those who are in solidarity with Cuba, that those programs must make interventions around the issues of economic development and empowerment in Cuba, around the issues of healthcare, around the issues of cultural tourism and cultural exchanges, the development and empowerment of African youth and support to women, both in Africa and in Cuba, and of importance to also use multilateral platforms that we are involved in. Here today, we do not only have the African countries and fraternal organizations represented. We have some members of the BRICS community who are here, who are also going to be having bilateral engagements with Cuba to look as to how they can, on a bilateral level, deal with the possible support to the Cuban people. We have to defy. Time has come, as we have seen the stance that the world has taken against apartheid Israel, that we must also defy the U.S. blockade against Cuba. It's an illegal act, and worse now, they've also enlisted Cuba as a terrorist nation when Cuba excels on humanitarian support. Cuba had to go to Italy and help the Italians in the scourge of COVID-19. Many people relied on the Cuban vaccine solutions and other supports, doctor support. The doctors from Cuba were out there. Every country in Africa, save Morocco, stands here today and say, we have a doctor trained from Cuba. We've got an engineer trained from Cuba. In our defense force, we've got ex-combatants who are now army generals trained by Cuba. And of importance is that Cuba never wants to exploit our mineral resources, to demand any financial reward from us. But Cuba has always left at a high price South Africa, Africa, without actually regretting, as they are continuing to do it now, with them supporting Palestine, but also with them working with all of us to defend our hard-won gains of the revolution.
You mentioned a number of key areas of collaboration, specifically health, but also interesting is that the ANC's Deputy President, Paul Mashatile, also thanked Cuba for the support they've provided in areas of education as well. Can you expand on that aspect?
Yes, the areas around tertiary education that Cuba has supported all of us, the number of engineers that have been trained in Cuba, the number of medical doctors that have been trained in Cuba. What is of importance also with Cuba around the area of education is how they ensure that through their basic education system, they include in their curriculum the history of the liberation movement. Here in South Africa, we hardly tell the history of our struggle in the formal education. The Cubans know better about where we come from, starting with the 1913 Land Act. It is part of the curriculum. And we need to ensure that internationalism that Cubans instill on their children, on their future leaders, is something that we must learn. And not only Cuba. We have Western Sahara here, who are represented by the Polisario Front. We've got the Prime Minister, and that is the only country, the only nation in Africa that is yet to be liberated against those that have captured their land, which is Morocco. They themselves are actually even having their schools named after Hector Peterson. They teach their children about the South African flag, not the ANC flag. They teach them the history of the African National Congress and the struggles of the people of South Africa and Africa broadly. And it is that as nations gathered here today, we will forever be indebted to the Cubans, will be forever indebted to the people of Palestine, even the Polisario Front of Western Sahara, them being in exile in a desert, but them also being able to say, our struggle is intertwined to their own struggle. And the Palestinians who are here today, who also came out very vocal in support with the Cuban plight and the call for the end to the blockade. So these are the things that Deputy President Paul Mashatile was raising, that we need to learn. We need to also plow back to the Cuban cause, particularly on the economic front. It cannot only be a political solidarity action that we take. We hope that the deliberations tomorrow will help us to come with concrete actions, as we have taken, proudly so, of taking the apartheid right to the World Court. As the world also was united against the South Africa apartheid regime, we need to also do that. People sacrificed. Cubans sacrificed. They left with dead bodies from Africa after fighting the apartheid regime and after the Battle of Cuba Valley. We also have a responsibility. There's no struggle that does not have casualties, and there's no revolution that goes without any sacrifice. And that is the mood here today.
Let me thank you for your time. That's the first Deputy Secretary General of the African National Congress, Nomvula Mokonyane, of course, telling us about the 7th installment of the Africa-Cuba Solidarity Conference.